Welcome to the second episode in a two-part Legendarium series about the epic siege of Smolensk, which took place from 1609 to 1611. On March 12, 1610, Mikhail Shuisky, nephew of Tsar Vasili IV, entered Moscow in triumph at the head of a combined Russian-Swedish army. Every bell in Moscow tolled to welcome the man who broke rebel power in northern Russia. When he returned to court, Mikhail boasted that he would next sweep the Poles from their siege of Smolensk. Instead, during an April 23, 1610 feast at his uncle's hall, Mikhail Shuisky drank from a cup of wine and suddenly tumbled over. His servants brought him home, where he died in unspeakable agony. The court noted that the sister-in-law of Vasili IV brought Mikhail his final cup of wine. Indeed, Mikhail had grown popular enough for some boyars to see him as a replacement for his unpopular uncle Vasili IV. Rumors swirled that the Tsar poisoned his brilliant and victorious nephew out of the fear that he would lose the throne to him. Vasili IV, perhaps to distract from these rumors, personally rode out with an army to drive the Poles from their positions around Smolensk. However, he proved vastly inferior to his nephew. The Poles defeated Vasili IV soundly at the Battle of Kulushino on June 24, 1610. Since the Tsar failed to pay his Swedish mercenaries, they switched sides during the battle and drove the Tsarist army from the field. Vasili IV fled, ordering his servants to throw his gold and fine furs onto the ground as he ran away. The Swedes and Poles stopped to pick up the treasures and allowed the Tsar to escape back to Moscow. Though Vasili IV saved his life, could he save his crown or his country? Melting snow in 1610 brought cleared roads which the Poles used to haul in their heavy artillery to Smolensk. Spring also brought a new Polish commander named John Potocki, who intended to finish the now year-long siege. After months of bombardment, on July 18th, 1610, the Poles punched open a hole in the Granovitaya Tower. They stormed once, and the Streltsy, or the Tsar's personal guard, held them off with a withering hail of arquebus fire. A second time, the Poles' mercenary companies stormed Granovitaya Tower, and this time they seized it. However, their triumph proved short-lived. The horn-handed artisans of Smolensk, the bakers, the carpenters, and the blacksmiths, took up their harquebuses and lined up on the other towers. They rained fire and lead upon the mercenaries in Granovitaya Tower, and the Polish victory soon counted for nothing. As winter 1610 entombed the country in ice again, Potocki readied for one more storm. This time he ordered his officers to sign a pledge that they would lead their men in person and not avoid gunfire. Though the Polish commanders fought bravely, they also died horribly, and in terrible numbers. Sigismund III of Poland grew so furious with determined and resilient Smolensk that he threatened to murder every Russian soldier inside if they did not surrender in 3 days. In reply, precisely 3 days later, the Russians blew up a mine underneath the main Polish artillery train, destroying many of their cannons. I doubt that improved the mood of the Polish king very much. By summer 1610, the Poles neared Moscow itself, and in July, Filaret Romanov finally persuaded Vasili IV to give up power at the tip of a sword. The rebels sent the former Tsar into a monastery to live out his days in silence and solitude. Vasili IV died 2 years later. A boyar council assembled in Moscow, beginning the Seven Boyars' reign. Few in numbers, frightened, and desperate to regain control, they tried to decide which tsar to support. Finally, they abandoned the faltering second false Dmitri and declared Prince Władysław of Poland their new tsar. An embassy headed by Filaret Romanov welcomed the Polish prince at his camp around Smolensk. However, Polish wolves smelled Russian blood. When Filaret greeted Prince Władysław, the Poles simply made Filaret Romanov a prisoner. King Sigismund III then tried to force Filaret to make him, rather than his son, the new Tsar of Russia. Filaret knew this would effectively turn Russia into a Polish province, and he refused. Filaret Romanov then became a prisoner in Warsaw. Sigismund III busied himself with seizing control of the border towns and installing a garrison in Moscow, but he still did not give up on the holdout in Smolensk. Hunger and illness finally did what Polish courage and steel could not. Within the city, soldiers grew so short of food that they could no longer stand at their posts. As the food grew bad, scurvy scythed the garrison, leaving men weakened and saddened, then suffering terrible leg pain and finally spongy, bleeding gums before they finally wheezed out their last. This disease whittled down the garrison to 200 men by spring 1611, one of the survivors being the hero Streltsy Oleszka. On June 3rd, 1611, nearing the second anniversary of the siege, every Polish artillery piece opened fire, tearing open breaches in the walls of Smolensk. Thousands of mercenaries came in rivers of humanity, and the enfeebled defenders crowded into stone-walled Dormition Cathedral to make their last stand. When it became clear that the cathedral would soon fall, one of the defenders detonated a powder store. It tore apart the massive building, killing hundreds of Poles with the blast, smoke inhalation, and pieces of stone singing through the air as shrapnel. Mikhail, Shane, and a few survivors holed up in Kolomna Tower, fighting to the end. At last, Shane's wounds weighed upon him, and the Poles dragged him back to Warsaw. Sigismund III of Poland, enraged by the city's 2-year defense, ordered Shane placed in a cage and paraded through the streets of Warsaw to prove his victory. The king then tortured Shane and tried to make him give up the location of the city's treasury. When Shane refused, Sigismund III threw him into prison, ignoring all rules of war. Shane and Filaret Romanov would not return to their homeland until 1619, by which time Filaret's son Mikhail I held the throne and ended the time of troubles. On September 10th, 1654, the 76-year-old Oleszka, now retired and pensioned, awoke to a thunderous ringing of bells across the city of Moscow. He learned that the church bells rang because Filaret's grandson, now Tsar Alexei I, had taken back Smolensk more than 43 years after Oleszka became one of the last men defending it. That wraps things up for this episode of the Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.